The trainer shoved a lighter set of dumbbells toward Sylvester Stallone's chest and told him the heavy rack was for real lifters, not retired movie stars. Stallone didn't say a word. He just slowly set his gym bag down, locked eyes with the trainer, and walked straight toward the heaviest weights on the floor. What happened in the next 45 minutes would become Los Angeles gym legend, a story whispered about for decades. What happened in the next 45 minutes would become Venice Beach legend, a story whispered about for decades. But we need to start at the beginning, and not the beginning you think, not Rocky, not fame. The beginning where Stallone was sleeping in the Port Authority bus terminal in New York because he couldn't afford a room. The beginning where he had $40 to his name and a script written on napkins and the backs of receipts. The beginning where every casting director in Manhattan told him his face looked damaged, his speech was slurred, and he should consider a career that didn't involve talking. Believe me, that's what they actually said to him. So here's Stallone in 1975. He hasn't sold the Rocky script yet. He's picking up odd jobs anywhere he can. He's done a softcore film he doesn't talk about. He's cleaned out lion cages at the Central Park Zoo. He's been an usher at a movie theater watching other people live the dream he was scratching at with broken fingernails. And somewhere in all of that he got obsessed with one thing that kept him alive when everything else was falling apart. The gym. He didn't have money for food most days, but he always found a way into a weight room. He'd trade favors. He'd offer to mop floors. He'd sneak in through back doors. The iron was the one thing in his life that responded to effort. You put in the work, the weight goes up. No politics, no casting couches, no rejection letters, just physics and willpower. Now Stallone had relocated to Los Angeles because a friend told him there was work for guys who looked tough, background roles, stunt work, anything. He scraped together bus fare and rode 3 days across the country with his dog, Butkus, a bull mastiff who was his only real companion. And within 2 weeks of arriving in LA, he found the Mecca, Gold's Gym, Venice Beach. This wasn't the franchise operation you see today with smoothie bars and towel service. In 1975, Gold's was a concrete bunker 2 blocks from the ocean that smelled like rust and old sweat. The equipment was battered, the mirrors were cracked, and the people inside were not casual fitness enthusiasts. They were serious. Arnold Schwarzenegger trained there. Franco Columbu trained there. Lou Ferrigno walked through those doors. This was the center of the bodybuilding universe, and everyone who stepped inside knew it. Get this. Stallone walked in wearing a torn gray sweatshirt, sweatpants he'd owned for 3 years, and sneakers with the sole peeling off the left one. He didn't have a gym bag. He had a plastic grocery sack with a towel in it, and the first person he encountered wasn't a fellow lifter or a friendly face. It was Vic Reeves. Vic ran the floor at Gold's, wasn't the owner, wasn't even a co-owner, but he acted like the place had his name on the deed. He was a former competitive bodybuilder who'd placed 3rd in a regional show in 1971 and decided that was enough credentials to become the gatekeeper of who belonged and who didn't. He had arms the size of most men's thighs, a permanent sneer, and a voice that carried across the gym floor, whether you wanted to hear it or not. Stallone walked past the front desk after paying his day rate, $5 he genuinely could not afford, and headed toward the free weight section. He picked up a pair of 35-pound dumbbells and started doing curls. Quiet, head down, not bothering anyone. That lasted about 4 minutes. "Hey," Vic's voice cut across the floor. "Hey, I'm talking to you, the guy with the face." Stallone set the dumbbells down. He turned around, his jaw tightened. Vic was walking toward him with that wide-shouldered strut that big men use when they want you to feel small. He stopped about 2 feet from Stallone and looked him up and down, slow, theatrical, the way a butcher inspects a cut he's not going to buy. "This gym's not a shelter, pal. You lost?" Now here's what nobody tells you about Stallone in this period of his life. He wasn't some timid, beaten-down guy who folded a confrontation. He'd grown up in Hell's Kitchen. His father was a Sicilian immigrant who communicated primarily through aggression. His mother was an astrologer and wrestling promoter who was, by all accounts, tougher than most men in the neighborhood. Stallone had been in more street fights by age 15 than most people see in a lifetime. He'd been kicked out of multiple schools. He had a chip on his shoulder the size of a cinder block. But he also had a script in his apartment that he believed was going to change his life, and he needed to stay out of trouble. So he did something that went against every instinct in his body. He swallowed it. "Just here to train," he said. His voice was low, steady. "Paid my $5 at the desk." Vic didn't move. "I don't care what you paid. I'm telling you, the serious equipment is for serious lifters. The machines are over there." He pointed toward a row of beaten-up Nautilus machines in the corner, the section where the beginners and the elderly and the people nobody respected were directed. "Start there. Maybe in 6 months you can touch the free weights." Stallone's hands closed into fists at his sides, his shoulders squared, every muscle in his upper body contracted. And then, very slowly, he unclenched his hands. He picked up his plastic bag, and he walked to the Nautilus machines without saying another word. I swear this happened. Multiple people who were there that day have confirmed it. Stallone used those machines for 2 hours. He worked chest, shoulders, triceps, biceps, and abs on equipment that barely functioned. One of the machines had a cable that slipped every third rep. Another one had a torn seat pad with the foam spilling out. He didn't complain. He just worked. And here's the thing, he worked with an intensity that started turning heads. Because Stallone didn't train the way bodybuilders trained. He didn't pose between sets. He didn't admire himself in the cracked mirrors. He attacked the weights with a ferocity that was almost uncomfortable to watch. His rest periods were 30 seconds. His sets went to failure and then past failure. By the end of the first hour, his shirt was so soaked with sweat it looked like he'd been swimming. A couple of the regulars noticed. A guy named Tommy Sacco, who trained at Gold's every afternoon, later said he'd never seen anyone generate that much intensity on machines that bad. It was like watching a guy try to punch his way out of a locked room, Tommy said, and that was exactly what was happening. But Vic noticed too, and Vic didn't like it. Here's the thing about guys like Vic. They don't disrespect people once and move on. The disrespect is the point. It's how they establish the hierarchy. And when Stallone didn't break, didn't leave, didn't show submission, it bothered Vic the way a splinter bothers you. Small but constant, impossible to ignore. So 40 minutes into Stallone's workout, Vic walked back over. "You're using those machines wrong," he said it loud enough for a whole floor to hear. Stallone was mid-rep on a chest press. He finished the rep, held the contraction for a 2 count, and then slowly let the weight down. He looked up at Vic. "Show me the right way then." Vic blinked. He wasn't expecting that. He was expecting an argument, confrontation, something he could use to justify kicking this ragged-looking stranger out. Instead, he got compliance. And compliance from someone who clearly wasn't afraid was more unsettling than defiance. "You wouldn't understand it if I showed you," Vic said. He folded his arms. "This isn't a playground. People train here for real competitions. Mr. Olympia guys walk through that door. You're taking up space. Listen to me carefully." That line, "you're taking up space," was the one that landed. You could see it hit Stallone physically. His head dropped about half an inch. His eyes went to the floor. Because that wasn't just a gym insult. That was the summary of his entire life up to that point. Every casting director, every agent, every producer, every landlord who'd evicted him, every person who'd looked at his face, heard his voice, and decided he was taking up space in their world. Stallone stood up from the machine. He was shorter than Vic by 3 inches and lighter by about 30 pounds. But he stood up with a stillness that made Vic take a half step backward, and that half step was the first crack. "I'm going to finish my workout," Stallone said. Not a threat, not a request. Just a statement of fact delivered with the certainty of a man stating the time. Vic recovered. He laughed, the kind of laugh that's designed to recruit the room. He looked around at the other lifters, expecting them to laugh too. A few did. Most didn't. Tommy Sacco turned back to his bench press and pretended he hadn't heard anything. And trust me on this, what happened over the next 3 weeks is where the story gets interesting. Stallone came back the next day. Same torn sweatshirt, same peeling sneakers, same $5 day rate he couldn't afford. He went straight to the Nautilus machines without being told. He trained for 2 hours. He left without speaking to anyone. He came back the day after that, and the day after that. And every single day for 3 weeks straight. Now you need to understand something about the culture of Gold's Gym in 1975. Respect was earned through exactly 2 things, consistency and intensity. You could be built like a Greek statue, but if you showed up twice a week and half-assed your way through sets, nobody gave you the time of day. Conversely, if you were built like a parking meter but you showed up every single day and trained until you couldn't stand, people started to nod at you. That was the currency. Stallone was accumulating that currency faster than anyone Vic had ever seen. By the end of week 1, a few of the regulars started saying hello. By the middle of week 2, Tommy Sacco offered to let Stallone work in on the bench press with him, which was a direct violation of Vic's machine section exile. Stallone accepted. He benched 225 for reps, which wasn't competitive with the bodybuilders in the room, but was respectable. More than respectable for a guy who weighed 180 pounds soaking wet. Vic watched this from across the gym. He didn't intervene, not yet, but his jaw was getting tighter by the day. You know what I find fascinating? Stallone never once talked about himself during those 3 weeks, never mentioned acting, never mentioned the script he was working on, never name-dropped, never tried to impress anyone with anything other than work ethic. The guys at Gold's assumed he was a construction worker or a dockhand or maybe an ex-con, and Stallone let them think whatever they wanted. He was studying them, every single one of them. He was watching how they moved, how they talked, how they carried themselves, how the hierarchy functioned. He was absorbing the world of physical culture the way a sponge absorbs water, and he was feeding all of it, every detail, every mannerism, every piece of dialogue, into the script that sat on the kitchen table in his studio apartment in Hollywood. The script was called Rocky. Now, day 15 is when the dynamic shifted, and it shifted because of something Stallone did that nobody expected. It was late afternoon. The gym was at peak capacity. About 40 guys on the floor. Vic was training a client near the squat rack, a rich kid from Brentwood who was paying him $80 an hour, which was absurd money in 1975. The kid was trying to squat 225 and his form was catastrophic. His knees were caving in, his back was rounding, and he was 1 rep away from a serious injury. Stallone saw it from across the room. He was mid-set on the pull-up bar, knocking out reps with a 25-pound plate hanging from a chain around his waist, which by this point had silenced any remaining doubts about whether he belonged in the free weights section. He dropped from the bar, walked straight across the gym and stepped up to the squat rack. "Stop," Stallone said to the kid. Vic's face went red. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Stallone ignored him. He looked at the kid. "Your knees are tracking too far inside your feet. You're going to blow out a ligament. Push your knees out over your toes. Sit back into it, not down into it." The kid looked at Vic. Vic looked at Stallone. The entire gym went quiet. And here's where the vulnerability showed up, the part that makes this story more than just a tough guy tale. Stallone looked at Vic, and his expression wasn't hostile. It wasn't triumphant. It was almost sympathetic. Because Stallone recognized something in Vic that Vic didn't recognize in himself. Vic wasn't a bad guy at his core. He was a guy who'd peaked at 3rd place in a regional bodybuilding show and never got past it, and the only power he had left was the power to decide who belonged. Take that away, and what did he have? Stallone saw himself in that. He saw the version of himself he could become if he let bitterness win. And for just a second his eyes softened, and Vic saw it, and it was worse than any insult. Because pity from a man you've been mocking is a mirror you can't look away from. "I'm trying to help the kid," Stallone said quietly. "That's all. No judgment, no agenda, no retaliation. Just one sentence that stripped the situation down to its bare components." The kid adjusted his stance the way Stallone suggested. He squatted the weight with clean form. He racked it and said, "Thanks, man." Vic said nothing. He stood there with his arms at his sides and his jaw working, and then he turned and walked to the back office. He didn't come out for 20 minutes. Mark this moment. This was the shift. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a man choosing competence over ego and letting the results speak. After that day, the social architecture of the gym rearranged. Stallone wasn't a refugee on the Nautilus machines anymore. He was training alongside the regulars. Franco Columbu, who trained at Gold's in the afternoons, spotted Stallone on the bench one day and struck up a conversation. Franco was intrigued by this intense, quiet guy who trained with a fury that didn't match his calm demeanor. They talked about boxing. Franco mentioned that his friend Arnold had just finished filming a movie and was looking for sparring partners to stay in shape. But that connection came later. What matters now is what happened on day 21. Now pay attention. This is the part everyone gets wrong when they tell this story. Day 21. Late afternoon. The gym was winding down, only about 12 guys left on the floor. Stallone was doing heavy deadlifts in the corner, pulling 315 off the floor with controlled aggression, each rep locked out at the top with his shoulder blades squeezed together. This was not a man who needed Nautilus machines. Vic walked out of the back office. He'd been different since the squat rack incident. Quieter, smaller somehow, even though he was still the biggest guy in the room. The swagger was gone. In its place was something harder to identify, a restlessness, a need to reassert himself. He walked over to Stallone, stood about 4 feet away this time, not 2. That extra distance told you everything. "You think you're something now," Vic said, but his voice was different. The performance was gone. This was just a man talking. "You come in here looking like a bum, you don't listen to me, you undermine me in front of a client, and now everyone acts like you own the place?" Stallone set the barbell down. He stood up straight. He wiped the chalk off his hands, one slow pass at a time. "I don't think I'm anything," Stallone said. "I'm just a guy who shows up." "That's not enough," Vic said, and here it was, the final time his core belief surfaced. "You don't have the build, you don't have the look, you don't have the genetics. Showing up doesn't change what you are." The 12 guys in the gym had all stopped what they were doing. Tommy Sacco was sitting on a flat bench with a dumbbell in each hand, frozen. A guy named Pete Grimkowski, who would later win the Mr. Universe title, was standing by the water fountain, watching. Stallone took one step toward Vic, just one, and that single step contained everything. Every night in the bus terminal, every slammed door, every casting director who said his face was wrong, every person who told him showing up wasn't enough. "Let me tell you something," Stallone said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in that room it carried to every corner. "I've been broke my whole life. I've been told I'm too short, too ugly, I talk funny, I'll never make it. You know what all those people had in common? They were standing still, telling a moving man to stop." He paused. He looked Vic dead in the eye. "I don't stop." 2 words, 12 letters, and they landed with the weight of a man's entire existence behind them. Vic's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His arms, those massive arms that he'd built his entire identity around, hung at his sides, useless. Because what do you say to that? What argument do you make against a man who just keeps showing up? Here's the answer: you don't make one. Vic turned around and walked away. Not to the back office. He walked out the front door of Gold's Gym, and 3 people who were there that day said he didn't come back for a week. Now stick with me. That's not the end of the story. That's the end of the first act. 6 months later, Stallone sold the Rocky script. You've probably heard the story. He was offered $360,000 for it. Enormous money, life-changing money. But the producers didn't want him to star in it. They wanted Robert Redford. They wanted Ryan O'Neal. They wanted Burt Reynolds. They wanted anyone except this mumble-mouthed, heavy-lidded unknown with no credits. Stallone said no. They came back with a lower offer and the starring role. He said yes. The budget was just over $1 million. They shot the whole movie in 28 days. Stallone wrote every scene, including the training montage, pulling directly from his experience at Gold's Gym. The punching of the meat carcasses, the running up the steps, the raw, unglamorous grind of a man who had nothing going for him except the refusal to quit. He didn't base Rocky on himself, not entirely. Rocky Balboa was a composite. But the emotional core, the engine that drove every scene, was that 3-week period at Gold's Gym where a man in a torn sweatshirt and peeling sneakers walked into a room full of giants and earned his place through nothing but relentless, grinding, uncompromising work. The movie came out on November 21st, 1976. It made $225 million worldwide. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Stallone was nominated for Best Actor and Best Original Screenplay. He was 30 years old. And here's the detail that kills me every time. This is the part of the story where I ask you to do one thing. If you've come this far with me, if this story has grabbed you by the collar the way it grabbed me when I first heard it, hit that subscribe button. Because stories like this don't get told enough, and I want to keep telling them. That's it. That's my ask. Now let me finish this. 2 weeks after Rocky premiered in Los Angeles, Stallone walked back into Gold's Gym. But this time he wasn't in a torn sweatshirt. He was wearing a leather jacket and sunglasses, and every single person in that gym knew exactly who he was, because his face was on the cover of every magazine in America. He walked through the front door. He paid for a day pass. He did not ask for special treatment. He did not announce himself. He walked to the free weight section, picked up a pair of 40-pound dumbbells and started doing curls. Tommy Sacco saw him first, walked over, shook his hand and said, "I knew it, man. I knew it the first week." Franco Columbu spotted him from the squat rack and gave him a nod that contained more respect than most men express in a year of conversation. And then Vic walked out of the back office. He stopped when he saw Stallone. Full stop, feet planted. The color left his face and came back in a different shade, something between embarrassment and awe and the particular grief of a man realizing he once tried to extinguish something that became a wildfire. He stood there for maybe 10 seconds, which felt like 10 minutes. Then he did something that nobody in that gym expected. He walked over to Stallone, and he extended his hand. "I owe you an apology," Vic said. His voice was stripped of every layer of performance. This was bone-deep honesty, the kind that costs a man something to produce. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything I said." The gym was watching. Everyone was watching. Stallone looked at Vic's hand, he looked at Vic's face, and then he did the thing that sealed this story into legend. He didn't shake the hand, not immediately. First, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out 2 tickets. He held them up. "These are for the premiere next week. Bring someone." He set the tickets in Vic's open palm. Then he shook the hand. "We're good." That was it. No speech, no lecture, no vindication monologue, no "I told you so" delivered from the mountaintop of success. Just a man who remembered being disrespected and chose generosity over revenge. Vic went to that premiere. He brought his wife. He sat in a dark theater and watched a movie about an underdog who walked into a world that didn't want him and refused to leave until the world changed its mind. And according to Tommy Sacco, who talked to Vic's wife afterward, Vic cried. Not during the fight scenes, during the training scenes. Because he recognized the gym, he recognized the machines, and he recognized himself in every character who underestimated Rocky Balboa. Now let me tell you what happened to Vic, because this story isn't complete without it. Vic Reeves stayed at Gold's Gym for another 3 years. But he was different after that day. The guys who trained there in the late 70s said he stopped being a gatekeeper. He stopped sorting people into categories of who belonged and who didn't. He started actually training people, really training them, with patience and attention and a generosity that hadn't been there before. He got his certification. He built a client base. He eventually opened his own small gym in Culver City that was never fancy and never famous but was known in the neighborhood as a place where anybody could walk in and be treated with respect. He named it Second Round Fitness. Think about that name. Think about where it came from. Stallone went on to become one of the biggest movie stars in the history of cinema. Rocky spawned 8 films and counting. He created Rambo. He wrote, directed, produced, and starred in movies that grossed billions of dollars worldwide. He was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame. He received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Screen Actors Guild. He built an empire out of the same raw materials he carried into Gold's Gym that first day: desperation, willpower, and the absolute refusal to accept someone else's assessment of his worth. But the people who knew him, the real ones, the guys from the Gold's Gym days, they all said the same thing. Stallone never changed at his core. The guy who showed up at Gold's Gym in 1975 with a plastic bag and a torn sweatshirt was the same guy who showed up at the Oscars in a custom tuxedo. The clothes were different. The man was identical. Tommy Sacco told this story at a bodybuilding reunion event in 2003. He was in his 60s by then, still training, still sharp. He stood at a podium and told the whole thing, start to finish, to a room of 200 people. And when he got to the part where Stallone gave Vic the premiere tickets, he stopped talking for about 5 seconds. The room waited. "That," Tommy said, "is the difference between a guy who got famous and a guy who was always great. Great was in him before anybody knew his name. Fame just gave the rest of us a chance to see it. And you know what? Tommy was right. But he missed one thing. He missed the most important thing. The reason this story endures, the reason people at Gold still tell it 40-plus years later, isn't because of Rocky. It isn't because Stallone became famous. It isn't even because of the beautiful symmetry of a mocked man returning in triumph. It's because of that moment at the squat rack. That moment when Stallone looked at the man humiliating him and felt compassion instead of rage. That moment when he saw Vic's third-place trophy and his borrowed authority and his desperate need to control who belonged, and instead of weaponizing that insight, he used it to protect a kid from blowing out his knee. That's who Stallone was. That's who Rocky Balboa was. Not the guy who wins the fight. The guy who takes the punches and keeps moving forward. The guy who gets mocked by the gatekeeper and responds by proving, through nothing but daily consistent presence, that the gatekeeper was guarding the wrong door. And that quiet power line? "I don't stop." 2 words that carried the weight of a man's entire history. No explanation needed. No follow-up required. Just a declaration of identity so simple and so true that the only response to it was silence. Vic learned that. Tommy saw it. Franco respected it. And 35 million people watched a movie about it without knowing they were watching a true story dressed up in boxing gloves. Stallone walked out of Gold's that day after giving Vic the tickets. He got into a car that was nicer than anything he'd ever owned. He drove back to his apartment, which was now a house in the hills. He sat down at his desk, and he started writing Rocky II. Because he wasn't done. He was never done. That was the whole point. I want you to remember something the next time someone tells you that you don't belong. The next time a gatekeeper shoves a finger in your chest and tells you the serious equipment isn't for you. The next time someone with a loud voice and borrowed authority looks at your torn sweatshirt and your peeling sneakers and decides you're taking up space. You remember what Stallone did. He didn't argue, he didn't fight, he didn't complain, he didn't explain himself. He just showed up the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. And he worked with such relentless intensity that the room had no choice but to rearrange itself around him. The room always rearranges itself around someone who won't stop. That's not a movie line. That's a law of the universe. Vic Reeves died in 2009. His obituary in the local Culver City paper mentioned that he'd been a gym owner and personal trainer for 25 years. It mentioned that he was beloved by his clients. It mentioned his wife and 2 sons. It did not mention Stallone. It did not mention Gold's Gym. It did not mention the 3 weeks in 1975 that changed the trajectory of 2 lives moving in opposite directions. But Tommy Sacco knew. The guys from Gold's knew. And now you know. The legend wasn't born in a boxing ring or on a movie set. It was born on a gym floor in Venice Beach, where a man with nothing refused to let a man with a little borrowed power take away the only thing he had left, the right to show up and do the work. That's the whole story. That's the whole legend. And legends, the real ones, they don't need a soundtrack or a slow-motion montage. They just need a guy in a torn sweatshirt who doesn't stop.